Oh, the founding fathers of the United States of America. Some of history's most brilliant minds, the scholars, lawyers, scientists, and doctors who rallied behind one common cause in the face of tyranny, the pioneers in modern statecraft, and the safeguarders of American freedom. Needless to say, some had different political views and visions from the newborn country. Feuding friends, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, were notoriously hot and cold, and their views on the power of central government plagued their relationship for life. Others diverged in attitudes towards slavery, the Constitution and religion. But let us not forget the men behind the myths, the idiosyncrasies, passions and quirks that set them apart as legends amongst mortals, or mortals amongst legends. Welcome to Intrigued Mind, and this is our exclusive eavesdrop into the private lives and passions of the founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson, third President of the United States and main author of the Declaration of Independence, was a man of many talents. One of his lesser known fields of inquiry was archaeology. At some time in his 20s, Jefferson organized an archaeological expedition of a Native American burial ground in Monticello, Virginia. He personally directed the fieldwork, analyzed his findings, and published his conclusions. His efforts have been lauded by future generations of archaeologists. For his methods, he relied on stratigraphy, which involves studying rock layers, and is now a core aspect of archaeological and geographical investigation. This essentially put Jefferson 1 century ahead of his time. He was also fascinated by animals, particularly American ones. In the face of European conceptions that American wildlife was inferior to Eurasian wildlife, Jefferson saw American beasts as symbols of vigor and audacity. Among his obsessions was the manaton. He did not differentiate it from the woolly mammoth, but he did study it at length, and even ordered the bones of one specimen to be shipped to the White House. In pure Jeffersonian fashion, he tried to assemble the parts for a skeleton on display, and it's now exhibited in the Monticello entrance hall. Jefferson's religious views meant he did not believe in extinction, and he purported that mammoths still roamed the Wild West. He also didn't fully accept the notion of fossils, which was still a patchy subject at the time. Despite not adhering to two of the fundamental principles of modern archaeology, he is considered a crucial figure in the development of the discipline and one of the founders of American archaeology. Alexander Hamilton was an extraordinary polymath, and besides his accomplishments in law, finance, the military and statecraft, he was also a man of great literary talent. When he was a teenager, a great hurricane struck the island of St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, where he lived and worked as an orphaned clerk. He wrote to his father in America detailing the horrors of the earthquake, and the letter was eventually published. His literary flair and powerful religiously charged imagery captivated local officials. They were so impressed that they raised funds for a scholarship for a young Hamilton to pursue higher education at King's College, now Columbia University. His love of reading and writing would accompany him throughout life, but his literary talents especially touched other people. A number of beautiful poems have been attributed to Hamilton. One, he wrote for a close friend as a eulogy to his deceased 2-year-old daughter. This is a final verse. Let reason silence nature's strife, and weep Maria's fate no more. She's safe from all the storms of life, and wafted to a peaceful shore. Another, he wrote for his wife Eliza Schuyler while they were courting. Eliza was so touched by the sonnet that she placed it in a small bag and hung it around her neck until her dying breath at the age of 97. It was found torn, crumpled, and sewn up with a string. Eliza must have been reading it her whole life. You might already know that George Washington, America's first president, distilled whiskey at Mount Vernon, but you might not know just how brilliant he was at it, and how shrewd he was at business. Before embarking on his distilling ventures, Washington inherited his father's estate at Mount Vernon, which was primarily devoted to tobacco farming. Washington would soon realize that tobacco farming damaged the soil, and it was incredibly labor intensive. Not only was it environmentally unfriendly, but it increased colonial dependence on England for supplies and income. For a revolutionary in the making, this was unacceptable. So instead, he opted for the production of mixed grains, specifically wheat, corn, rye and clover. He used tremendously experimental fertilization techniques, and expanded his farm with another mill. With this new mill, he could buy grain from the local community and sell the flour on local markets. He could also charge farmers to use the mill. Within several years, he could feed all the inhabitants of his estate, and had set up overseas trade routes as far as England and the Caribbean. Then, in 1797, a Scottish farm manager named John Anderson made Washington an offer he could not refuse. John had experience in whiskey distilling and offered to help in operations. The time was just right. Not only did the estate have heaps and heaps of grain, but the American market was ripe for the picking. Demand had soared from the influx of Scottish and Irish settlers in the colonies, as well as from the many British blockades during the American Revolution. Within no time, the distillery became Mount Vernon's most profitable source of income. In 1799 alone, the estate produced 11,000 gallons of whiskey, with each gallon sold at 60 cents to $1. It might not seem it, but that was some serious income for the time. It became one of the largest distilleries in the nation, with at least 7 varieties of whiskies with flavours like cinnamon and persimmon. The standard recipe through was 60% rye, 35% corn and 5% malted barley. Today, the Mount Vernon distillery remains faithful to the original recipe, as well as to the great entrepreneurial legacy of the nation's father. John Adams, the second President of the United States, was unquestionably a gifted statesman and a fervent believer in the natural rights of men. He was one of the few founding fathers who unequivocally opposed slavery, and in this list the only one not to have owned any. But he did not leave the same brilliant legacy as some of his counterparts. Contemporary and later commentators have scorned aspects of his presidential term, deriding him as a bastion of British conservatism. However, John Adams' worst enemy was John Adams himself. He lamented that he was, quote, obnoxious, suspected and unpopular. Mausoleums, statues, monuments will never be erected for me, he wrote. I am not, never was, and never shall be a great man. The sad truth is that many future generations have agreed with his own prognostication. He has been described as overshadowed in talent and achievement by his predecessor and successor, Washington and Jefferson. Though honest, skilled and dedicated to public service, he has also been characterized as petty, jealous, stubborn and vain, attributes which plagued his personal relationships and evidently his own sense of self-worth. Benjamin Franklin is America's Renaissance man par excellence. Inventor, writer, printer, statesman, philosopher, the list goes on. But perhaps you didn't know that he was a formidable swimmer, something which in the 18th century was completely alien to most Westerners. In his Bostonian youth, Franklin spent much of his time on and off boats, and he learned to swim at a very young age. He famously had a very limited formal education, and as a child devoted much of his spare time to reading and swimming. At 11 years old, he even invented fins for his hands and feet to increase his swimming speed. At the age of 18, he moved to London with plans to buy a printing machine, but ended up spending a year and a half there. To the amazement of contemporary Londoners, Franklin would regularly swim in the Thames River, turning heads at a skill considered near miraculous for the time. He even started to teach one of his colleagues from the printing press where he worked. One day, Franklin was cruising on a boat with a student and a few of his friends. When they heard about Franklin's unique skill, they begged him for a demonstration. After wowing them with all sorts of tricks, Franklin stayed in the water. He proceeded to swim 3.5 miles, accompanying the boat right to the other side of London. Franklin was even tempted by the idea of opening a swimming pool and travelling around Europe. In the end, he seized an opportunity to open a printing press in Philadelphia. But just imagine America's most beloved founding father pursuing this wacky career of an 18th century swimming instructor. Franklin would swim regularly over the course of his life. He taught close friends, those who were particularly frightened of the water. He helped them overcome their fears. He always advocated for the health and benefits of swimming and encouraged parents to teach their children. Some say his early love of swimming fostered his love of science that would feed his celebrated intellect for the rest of his life. We all know Samuel Adams for the beer. Besides this, he was a gifted statesman and political theorist who was loved and admired by contemporaries and future generations for his wisdom, leadership and compassion. Interestingly, his compassion was what led him to gamble his political career from the start. In his adolescence, he became a clerk and by his mid-20s was a local tax collector in Boston. At that time, in the 1750s and 60s, colonial taxes were sky high and people's purses were thinner than ever. Being a man of the people, Adams deliberately failed to collect taxes, awarding him the underlying appreciation of taxpayers, but unfortunately leaving him liable for the shortfall. By 1765, Adams owed £8,000 to the government, a mere $1.5 million adjusted for inflation. Both the town meeting and Adams faced bankruptcy, and Adams's political opponents exploited the situation, securing the hefty court judgment against him. His allies and friends bailed him out for the majority. The town meeting wrote off the rest. Adams' reputation survived the embarrassing ordeal remarkably well. His popularity remained buoyant, and he went on to pursue the political career that led him to greatness. James Madison, America's fourth president, dubbed the father of the Constitution, was the ultimate bookworm. His predecessor and friend Thomas Jefferson is often considered more bookish. Jefferson's library was larger, and he famously offered to sell it to the Congress as a replacement for the one which British soldiers had burned in 1812. But Madison not only likely read more, his love for reading surpassed Jefferson's. No other president relied more on books to inform government policy and political philosophy. Madison devoured books on history, political theory, theology, philosophy, economics, and law. 1,300 volumes featured in his 9-page list of recommended books for the American government. That's not counting all the others he would have read. He had a strictly utilitarian approach to reading, devoting his energies to material he could apply in real life, and therefore veered away from novels and poetry. It might then be of great surprise to hear that Madison was, besides Abraham Lincoln, the only sitting president to accompany soldiers into battle. During the War of 1812, Madison rode off to the American lines with his entourage, armed with a pair of dueling pistols which he had borrowed from his advisor. His intention was to rally the troops. However, when artillery fire telegraphed just how close the enemy's position was, Madison suggested withdrawing to the rear. The story's continuation is fairly bleak. US troops were routed by the British, forcing the evacuation of the city. In the chaos, the White House and the Capitol were set ablaze by the victorious British. Whether he was inspired by the contemporary leaders in Europe, or whether he romanticized the legendary commander-in-chiefs in his history books, one thing is for certain: Madison was not a coward, but perhaps his knowledge was best put to use in government rather than on the battlefield. John Jay is one of the lesser-known founding fathers. Nonetheless, he was a formidable statesman who was well versed in law. He served as Chief Justice under Washington, as well as Governor of New York, and he co-authored the famous Federalist Papers, among other achievements, particularly in state diplomacy. But Jay above all was a family man. Growing up, Jay had two siblings who were blinded by smallpox and another brother who was mentally disabled. When his father passed, Jay became the sole provider of the family, covering everybody's finances and tending to their medical and emotional needs. In 1801, after his most active decades in politics, Jay declined the roles of Governor and Chief Justice and left high politics, never to return. He retired to Westchester County, New York, where he became a farmer. 1 year later, Jay's 45-year-old wife Sarah Livingston died. He was devastated by the loss. He never remarried, instead devoting his life to farming. In his later years, he increasingly turned to God. In 1821, he became president of the American Bible Society, believing that the best way to achieve world peace was by spreading the Christian gospel and that Christianity's moral teachings were fundamental for good government. That's all for now, folks. When you next hear about these great men, perhaps you'll remember their wacky hobbies, insecurities, hidden talents, torments, and personalities. Regardless of their noble and canonized achievements, they were just men after all. For more videos of the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigue Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below. See you next time.